All right, ladies and gents, good evening, and welcome to another edition of A Different View. Like we had talked about last time here when we were on our last episode there, I said we would do a July 4th episode. Of course, today is not July 4th, but it is July 4th weekend, or considered to be July 4th weekend. So we're going to get into it. There's a lot to cover here, so please bear with me. This will be a lot of information to unpack, kind of like the Juneteenth episode a little bit. But again, to kind of put a certain wrapping and bow around this holiday, I think it bears note to talk about some certain things. So again, bear with me as we go on in this, and we'll get there together. So July 4th, 1776. I want to preface this episode, ladies and gents, with a certain, and forgive me if I get excited because some of this topic is very excitable. I want to preface this episode by saying to those listening to pay attention to the usage. You hear me say it a lot on my episodes, but pay attention to the usage of certain words and phrases. To have the certain levels of imbalance, if you want to say it that way, while life will always have its imbalance. That's another thing, is also paying attention to how do I say this? Broadening of terms, ambiguity, obscurity, words and phrases that are used to almost distract. Because a lot of what goes on in life, especially in talking about, this podcast, A Different View, in order to get to the level where you can confuse folks, you gotta do a little bit like a carnival. You got that little carnival game we've all seen, the little ball in the cup and switching positions. You have to pay attention to where the ball is in all this. And I think a lot of people have built some realities here off some things that actually are not true at all. Like not true at all. You can kind of rationalize it a little bit. And again, this kind of goes pointing to this subject. Those who celebrate July 4th, so be it. Similar to, and we'll get into this when we get into Thanksgiving. Of course, we'll talk about certain things as we approach next year and different days and all that kind of thing. And this is not to, because certain people will start throwing around the words like unpatriotic. And although you have a certain dedication to wherever you live on the planet, because maybe some people will listen to this that are not from the United States, or North America, I should say, excuse me. Maybe you're not from North America, you're not from Canada, you're not from Mexico, maybe you're listening somewhere, Central America. A friend passes this episode along to you from another place in the world. Understand that many of these principles have got zero to do with the coastlines in which we live. Much of what I'll be talking about this evening's got something to do with the goodness to people that should be done and accomplished around the world, and the harm that was done from other nations around the world, culminating on this day. In reality, when we have our barbecues, when we have, much like Juneteenth and other holidays, when we have these days, these are days of remembrance. These are days of reflection upon innocent men and women of whom were attacked, lost their lives, lost their homes at the hands of greedy people. For every firework you fire off, and again, see, because again, a lot of times it's to counteract a lot of this, deflection is used. Certain tactics humans have picked up along the way when the fire gets too hot in the kitchen, per se. One of them is deflection, or, you know, throwing accusations and such, which is what has most of the world and the problems it's in. It is easier for people to, again, distract from a certain topic than it is to truly identify, talk about, and bring resolution to tough topics. And this is definitely one of them. Of course, we call it Independence Day. I think it is fair when you look through history, you have to understand that war broke out in England. When they talk about a revolution, had zero really to do with America per se, other than the fact that the war between Europe and trying to rectify their greedy ways poured over not only into Africa but also into the Americas. And again, a lot of this is hard for me to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. I don't. When I record, this isn't an attack. This isn't might look that way, especially when people start to feel guilty about what's going on, which we should. Such horror that has gone on, especially that we've grown up in. Many of these people that we know actually are family members. We can point back to some of these people, friends that knew someone who was involved. Again, even to our own family members. We look back into the 1700s, the 1800s. And even, through the 1900s until today. And we think it's so long away. Time in those regards, especially when you're dealing with such horror to humanity, is not that far off. That's another one of these kind of broadened ideas that those who want to keep things the way they are want you to believe. And this is not a knock to those who have established certain things from what they've been given. At the end of the day, they did gain credit from what occurred. Takeovers and such happen in life always. And there are benefits that come from it. From such horror and stuff like that. You've had nations of people, both sides of each gender, find out that they are more than what their ancestors said they were. So from such horrible things, a lot of good does come out of it, as is the balance of life. For what horrible damage you have, a lot of good comes from it. But many times the definitions of words and the misuse of certain things is used to solidify a different thing. Many times on Independence Day, we look into certain things as paying respect to those who have served. So in getting in this subject here, we have to recognize that there is a danger when you go too far. Again, in many of my episodes, you guys have heard me reference balance and the importance of balance. When a person looks at a subject one way or the other, hence why the title of this podcast is A Different View, when we don't take account both sides of these topics, no matter how hard they might be to accept, we run the risk of becoming unbalanced. And when that happens, you open the door for a lot of harm. A lot of harm. And when it comes to the military, first of all, should thanks be given to the military? 100%. Should thanks be given? And then this is, again, these things tie in together. A lot of people think they don't, but they do. Should thanks be given to our police department, to the first responders, right? So doctors, nurses, firemen, anyone who is as considered as a first responder. Now, again, a lot of this we saw during this coronavirus, worldwide outbreak here. But at the end of the day, you had a lot of men and women. See, again, another one of those generalizations is another word used. One of those generalizations used is that, nurses really don't have that much importance. And again, sometimes you get gender that flip-flops over into this, like the idea that males couldn't be nurses. If you can take care of somebody, you can take care of somebody. And somewhere along the line that got thrown in by people that honestly are not okay with the characteristics to whatever gender they are, that they assume you have to be one way or the other in order to be masculine or feminine, which is not true. If you do a little study, and something just as easy as going on your phone and kind of Googling it, certain colors that we use to talk about boys and girls were not the same colors we used years ago. Many of the things that people will say are right or wrong are solely not because they're right or wrong. It's just who is okay with what at a certain time period in history. As we live our lives here, and as we are studied in living our lives here, we change. We change up what we do. You can go back in time. You can see men painted their nails before war. Yet today it's looked upon as if it's a negative to do so. You're laughed at, ridiculed, mocked about it, which at the end of the day is silly. As a person starts to grow within themselves, you realize how silly that is for people to involve in that kind of behavior. And while they are allowed to, of course, we all make our own choices in life. At the end of the day, much like here with this revolutionary war on these lands, people make choices. Whether for good or bad, or whether for accepted or not accepted, and the consequences that come thereof. So when we talk on the military, of course, every place needs protection, but you must temper that with understanding the buildup, how it was created, what it was created for. Truth is, ladies and gentlemen, in order for the type of takeover, and it was a takeover that happened on these lands, you have to have some sort of protection to keep from something happening to you as a result of such horror. And that is where the heartbreaking part for me comes in, because we have good, honest men and women who have pledged their lives to such a noble attribute as defense. Because true defense over your home, over your possessions, things that you have actually worked hard for, defense of those things is necessary, because you will have people come to take them. Europe and many nations back here that you can see through the years exploited that. Well-meaning people who have their own issues. No one is perfect. Again, you'll have a lot of people talk about Africans having slaves and natives turning on each other, and that happens throughout all of history. I mean, for crying out loud, Europe actually used their own people as collateral to take these lands. That's what every one of those wars was about. French-Indian War back in the 1700s had nothing to do with some noble idea. That was just infighting inside of Europe, pouring over on these lands as to who was going to take it all. That's why you see smacks of Creole down south, where you have a lot of things, and you do study on Southern accents, you see where a lot of the language we speak comes from. Many times we assume that we're American, and there's an originality in doing so, and the truth is, it's not very original at all. Things are borrowed from other places in the world in which we come from. And the truth is, we are descendants of those who were either forcefully brought to these lands or people who took over these lands forcefully. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the truth. And it also gives a level of depth, because you begin to realize you can broaden your view, that you're not bound, especially for people who feel, this is where we're going to be. You get to broaden your view. Life is not as shallow as it's made to be. And maybe this will help somebody hearing this. And if it is, so be it. Not only, ladies and gents, is this episode 1776 episode. But it is also Sunday Message. And again, we have talked on here about Christianity, how I am Christian. For those who are not, I do apologize. Some of these things may offend you. That is not the point in this. The point in this is actually to point out some very serious inconsistencies so that we all can grow regardless of what or who we believe in. But specifically speaking to Christians who had a hand in this type of horror and genocide. To actually use scripture to say that these people weren't deserving of these lands, to come up and make up things that were the basis for things like eminent domain and manifest destiny. No one single person or group of people has been given by the Creator the right to claim all for themselves. You have grossly misinterpreted scripture if you do that. This belongs to God, to whom God will to allow people to live in peace, and that is all people, the last I checked. Very few verses in the Bible you can sit there and say when it comes to people living freely where they are not allowed to do so in peace. Matter of fact, the Bible talks about doing all that is possible, if it be at all possible, to live in peace. Many times people take scripture verses to much like slavery and much like saying that natives weren't allowed this land and all the kind of sick, twisted stuff that you see in the Indian Removal Act, the trail of the result of that act, the trail of tears, on and on. And again, as we continue to study and find out what's been hidden, which was done on purpose, you realize that there's more than just who we call natives here. You start doing studies of the DNA of the native on these lands, you realize there were many people living here. Funny, in talking about Africans, black people, and again, at one point, ladies and gentlemen, this is another one of these things that you can look up. The words and terms black and white used for legal reasons to divide incorrectly were never used at one point. At one point, Europeans living on these lands were called Euro-Americans, European Americans. Why? Because they're from Europe. Same as African American, same as Asian American, so on and so forth. We are visitors here on this land. I got to say it again because I know it's wrecking the psyche of people, and I get that. But there's a gravity to this to understand we have a responsibility to each other. Getting caught up in consumerism and capitalism and constantly looking for your own, that you forget the person next to you is one, the design of stuff like this to keep this sick machine going, and two, to hurt yourselves in the process. If you can buy into a mentality where you will hurt and kill someone else to hold on to stuff you cannot take past the grave, you will do it to anyone. And that's what they want. By the they, I mean those who have set up this sick system and keep it running. Freedom of speech, as much as it is a right of all humans, we all are given a right to speak and to speak freely, while understanding there's penalties for what you say. At the same time, silencing such things is horrible. And that if a government is designed to protect the people from such things, many of the things that happened in 1776 shows as a very serious lack when it comes to democracy. If a government is set up for the people so that people can live freely, I'm going to say it again, the stuff that you see historically, and maybe that's a reason why they're trying to, in different states, twist and eliminate history. One, you can't do that because the actions of humans have already been done. You just slow down someone else from knowing what happened. You can never fully hide the truth. I think if you go back into World War II, you can clearly see Adolf Hitler was horrible at it. You will always find people who have these types of misconceptions about humanity. Sometimes they go astray and they have some very serious misconceptions. But understand that going back to the respect that we should give to military people, participants, if you will, soldiers, men and women who have broken up their homes and their families, we owe them a debt we can never repay. That is true. But also understand there were pawns in a serious, sick game. No different than another pirate helping another pirate protect their stolen treasures. You had innocent men and women dying. By the time the land rush happened in the 1800s, you had almost 2 million acres of land filled in a day, which is funny that they talk about how certain things can occur to help the wrongs that were done to people in a day. In certain places say that. I would assume when you're moving that much property, you probably need a couple of days. But just to see stuff like that, to know this was the type of evil going on these lands is horrible. People told they had no rights to the land they were already living on freely solely because someone else wasted their resources hundreds of years prior. It's horrible. That's why when they talk about slavery lasting for 400 years, it's way longer than that. You've had this thing go on way, way past. I mean, Lord, if you're talking the 13, 1200s, and again, these are all things that you can look up, ladies and gentlemen. If by the time 1492 came around and Christopher Columbus was looking for a new world, which was no more than just orders from Spain, England involved, you had kings and queens, everyone had similar types of dominions where they were living. This was not some just willy-nilly kind of loose cannon expedition. That was an organized spy attack. All you have to do is re-look at the story and see it. Columbus was looking to help Europe acquire. That's it. And moving anybody in their way that they could. Again, at the end of the day, we're talking about land and resources, folks, and sharing. Sharing things and living life in peace and balance is what has this the way it is. So, I'm a little deal out of the way here. Some things about the word independence, because I'm big on definitions of words and phrases. To be independent is to be free to be free of outside control, not depending on another's authority. Also, you see part of the definition that talks about also not depending on another for livelihood or subsistence. When you look up both words, livelihood and subsistence, one, livelihood is a means of securing necessities of life. The word necessities there referring to things that are absolutely necessary. Things that are absolutely necessary. Let's be honest, when we go back into 1776, Europe fighting for control for freedom from outside control, from themselves. Taxation was a thing that was brought up. But again, at the point, one, that Columbus was sent out a few years prior. And again, I reference this thought. When we look at things in history that happened, when 1492 occurred, that didn't happen 2 days before. Columbus's expedition, and again, humans are recording history here. It's much like how people go a little they go a little awry and not thinking that God is that basic, that creation is only 2,000 years. You're talking about the one who sits on time, who makes time and holds time together. Don't give God such lack of credit that something as magnificent as this planet, from the bottom of the sea all the way to the tops of the heavens, as it is said in the Bible, only happened over 2,000 years. This has been in the heart of God forever and will continue on because it's something God planned. So independence of from outside, freedom from outside control. You cannot find freedom from outside control by controlling another person's freedom. I mean, talk about an oxymoron, and that's what happened by having these wars here, by taking these lands here. There were no treaties signed. Treaties that you see there, agreements between two people, not when one group of people was not ready at all for the attack that Europe brought. And again, life has morphed from all of this stuff that has happened all these years ago. And there's different ways that we can celebrate it. Like I said at the outset of this, there's different ways we can look at this from state to state. It also shows there's a responsibility here to work harder every day to make life better. We've had greats of grandparents, parents, living and dying in such horrible times around such sickness and greed and hate that's birthed from such greed. Almost to the point where you'll have people who believe so deeply in these things, have gone so far one way or the other, that at the end of the day, they would say things like, without my defense of this country, you would have no job. What horrible things to say to people. We all live and bleed and die down here. We are dependent upon each other to make it. And that's the lie that they want you to believe, that someone else is inferior. You don't need them to make it. And they want you to believe that. So as soon as that you X off one group of people, it makes it easy. It's a chain reaction. And you take out more people and more people and more people until the only ones left were the ones who started all this to begin with. That's the name of that's what Monopoly is what we play. That's the board game we play. And while you can have fun with the board game, understand the design behind it. Life here, many times we live life so too freely. Too freely. Frivolous is another word that's used with that. Well, there's no gravity, there's no depth of what's going on. This is very, very serious stuff. When you talk about a revolution, because it's called the Revolutionary War, a revolution, by definition, deals with revolving. When you look in Latin, the word revolve, means back, and volvere, or roll. You see the term rollback back when Walmart was really in its boom. Now it's just kind of living off its fame. But when it first started, you had the big old smiley yellow face that had rollback. That's another term for revolution, of changing the price, where you roll it back to a different time. There was no revolution on these lands in 1776. That was extermination we all witnessed, that we read every day on these books. That's what it looks like when people abandon sharing and they decide to take over. That's what it looks like. So all these stories you see, this is what it looks like. And I apologize for a lot of the pausing here, ladies and gents, but a lot of this that I'm seeing, it's hard to read. It's hard to say. You have to get to a certain point where you almost disconnect from what you've learned in order to see another side that's there. And it is there. It is there. One of these other words here that I was talking about before with independence was subsistence. Subsistence deals with maintaining and supporting oneself at a minimum level. And with such imbalance between the people who can support and not support themselves, I find it shocking that a group of people who were saying that they were entitled to these lands needed to come to these lands to support themselves because they could no longer do so in England. They needed the help of the French, the Italians. They all needed each other's help, and they've formed one wild conglomerate to come and start taking. Now, again, I don't say this while it will, I don't say this to incite anger, but repentance. People choose which one they want to go toward. This is where you start to see your fellow man and woman as a brother and sister, as a fellow member of humanity, and not 3/5 of a person, not someone who isn't entitled to anything, but true hard work. You know, when you go back to the land rush here in Oklahoma and such horrible atrocities in the state of Oklahoma, it's talking about the military, of which we should be thankful for. The U.S. military used to forcefully remove people who were already free to these lands. You need no legal document. When you start using legal documents, you're hiding behind something, especially in those terms. It wasn't used for protection. They weren't using legal or law or moral things for protection. That was for takeover. It was to substantiate takeover. So I mean, these are just some of the things, folks, to watch out for. And again, I've already kind of gone over eminent domain, which is the right of government to say that they can take someone else's property and use it for helping out the states or helping out the union, the terms used back in the 1800s. Today, we would say United States of America, USA, US, all that kind of thing. It's just the words change over time, but the same thing is in play. And while some of these things are necessary to help a society function, of course, which is why you have checks and balances and why the checks and balances need to be checked and balanced, at the end of the day, it was just an excuse to just take a made-up thing. And at the time, especially you go back further to the beginnings of the words to the phrase eminent domain, you go back into the 15th century. So you got the 1400s ripping and roaring. This is a medieval Latin term that talks about out from proprium, which is property. Exproprium, as it's said in Latin, which is where we get certain little basis for words there that you have heard in the Catholic Church, which is excommunicate, where you kick someone out from something, from the communication inside the Catholic Church. Just to break down the word in a more paraphrase, if you will. It's just the wildest stuff to see. The fact that they even put it into the Constitution, this idea that it's okay for government to do that. That by the time 1789 rolled around, they started solidifying such horrors they did on these lands that are quote unquote celebrated on July 4th. Not even realizing that part of the war didn't end on 1776, took a little bit longer for it to officially end. But still, all the damage had been done by then. You already had all the slaves over here to be a workforce. And this is something that I'll deal with on the Labor Day version of a different view, but this idea inside the workforce, you have to get people to buy into a certain mindset that they're not good enough. And if you can weaken a person's mind like that, you can get them to do a lot of what you want them to do, whether right or wrong. And a lot of what has gone on in the workforce, which honestly is just an extended slave force, which again, when you're talking about annihilation, it might start at one group of people. It does not end there. It does not end there. The slow boil in the hot water, as used in many sermons, the slow boil, I believe, for lobsters. And for those out there who are good at cooking, please correct me if I'm wrong, whether lobster or crab, but all you got to do is start slow boiling something. Don't realize it till it's too late. That's the idea with all this, which is why we have to be careful with the freedoms, with the rights and the Bill of Rights and all the rights people have, while they were excluding other people from certain rights that they already had. Understand those same things can be used against you. If anyone can write down something to say they give it to you, they can also take it from you. So we have to be careful to be responsible with the abilities we've been given. This idea of manifest destiny, and this is where the church starts to get involved with this, and this is kind of where I'll end on this. The idea that God blessed Europe to expand in these lands as justifiable. Now, again, something that you start seeing happening, whether it was in the 1800s, did not happen then. It started before that. Of course, you can see evidence of it by having folks in the Catholic Church sign off on taking slaves from Africa. There's an idea where people got too haughty, is the word you see in the Bible. They thought it made sense, which is why, again, I mentioned this in an old episode. If you say you love God and you have any semblance of this kind of stuff in a church pew, around people where you're friends with, all that kind of thing. And again, I apologize, ladies and gents, if I get a little impassioned, we'll say it that way, about this. At the end of the day, these are horrors that nobody should be signing off on. And the God, and again, for those who do not believe in Christianity, a God who would send a son to stretch out and die for humans, to actually love them that much, would then be about as schizophrenic as possible to sign off and say something like, yes, you have the right to take from something I've already given freely to people. You got to have some sort of disconnect from things to truly believe that and pass that around to folks. In the Bible, it talks about an idea of not thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think. And I think a lot of times that's where a lot of these misnomers and conceptions come into play, is that people start to take little onesies and twosies and think more highly than they should on something. And that's not to say you shouldn't think highly of yourself. You should be confident in yourself. But when you get to the point where you're detached from other people around you, that's when it becomes more highly than you ought to think. This idea of bringing resolution to all this, especially, and again, from a Christian perspective, when you talk about the healing of these lands, many times we look toward immorality or freedom of sexuality or drug misuse and all that kind of thing. And while there are certain things there to be considered and discussed, at the end of the day, to point fingers at those things and not look at the involvement of and continued support in such wrongs that happen on these lands all the way back then is just as much, if not more, culpable. You cannot say that people should be living wholly on lands where you had support for such death. and sit by and do nothing, say nothing. If Christians then, whether called Quakers or Puritans or whatever name was used then, such denominations that have been built up now, if you are at the point where you say you love people and love God so much and watch this kind of stuff happen, that is the challenge. When do you stand up and speak out against such dark? And we've seen the spawn of it soak in through every government function and people interaction that we have seen over all this time since then. It's telling, much like the movie Poltergeist. When you mess with such holy things, you put something on yourself that people call it juju, karma, all other kinds of terms. You cannot think you just go through life willy-nilly without repercussions. And that's not me saying something to make light of something or some sort of curse on people or anything like that. This is just showing what happens when the train derails. This is what it looks like. And that's not to say in any other form of humanity from history, past, present, or future, that you won't have problems. I believe I said that here at the beginning of this episode. That's not the case. The case is to consistently be on guard so that we correct what was done wrong and always be on guard to correct when something goes wrong. Then the more that we get okay with being like that, the more okay life will be. It's the way it was designed to be. And much of this is chasing after resources and stuff. Again, y'all have heard me say it. You cannot take it with you. You cannot take it with you. And you cannot serve God and riches. In the Bible, it calls it mammon. You have to pick and choose. And again, our kids' lives, our friends, families, people's lives are at stake with this. Of course, I could go on and on about this topic. I've definitely gone on long enough here. So this is where we're gonna put a pause on this. Again, I don't expect me to be done anytime soon with talking about life with you guys. So this is where we'll put a pause on this. And again, I'll have this episode just like many of them, all of them. If there's anything you guys have heard on here, you got any feedback on anything like that, of course, let's keep it respectful. I ask that you keep it respectful, but any information, notes, anything like that, of course, this is about having conversation. This is about understanding the world in which we live around so we can make it better for others when we leave, for all the others after we're dead and gone. Well, guys, thanks for joining me here on this episode. And as always, look to find the beauty in a different view.